Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm excited to introduce you to Shana Frydman, who is actually, we actually went to high school together.
Yes, we did.
My father recently said to me, he's like, you know so many cool people. I'm like, I really do. So
I feel the
welcome,
same way.
right? I'm so lucky to have you here. Thank you, Shana, for saying yes and for participating in our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, Shana, tell me a little about yourself professionally, and then we're going to set the stage for this conversation.
Great. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have a PhD in social welfare and policy, which is kind of like nerdy academic social work from Hunter College grad school at CUNY grad school. So, and in that space, I did scholarship and studying around the experience of Orthodox Jewish women becoming sexually active. So a little bit adjacent to what we're talking about today and some of your topics. And my career since 2001 has primarily been in the space of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, primarily focused in the Jewish communities. So I've worked in shelters. I've done frontline work as a case manager, a clinical case manager with individuals who are in relationships that are abusive. I've worked as a clinical therapist for them. And then my last position, the position, I'm the outgoing CEO of Shalom Task Force, and I'm currently their clinical director. And in that position, I was the CEO of a national organization that addressed domestic violence in the Jewish community. So that was anything from, policy speaking, and also making sure that we're offering best practices of service to the communities that we serve.
And would you say that Shalom Task Force, probably, at least in my perspective, was kind of one of the first national organizations that really addressed the Jewish family life and gave language, I think, to abuse?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm really proud of my years, continue to be proud of my years at Shalom Task Force. Shalom Task Force is a great birth story. Can I use that word? Birth story here.
please,
It's a great
please.
story. So Shalom Task Force was birth, I guess,
Was
born.
born.
Born, that's better. I'm gonna warn, I'm actually living in Israel now, so I'm a little bit off, a
I
little
can't
tired,
wait
but
to see
okay,
how
we're
that
good.
shows up.
We'll see how that shows up. So it was born in 1993, which is actually a very early in the battered women's movement, in the sense of if those of us who are old enough to remember 94, when the O.J. Simpson trial was happening, right? So actually before then, when there wasn't a great national discourse around intimate partner violence, and it was really born by some women living in the five towns in Queens being approached by their pediatrician saying that they were Orthodox Jewish women who were clearly victims of domestic violence, who had no services within the community, and it was a barrier for them getting services, and they were going outside the community. And what can we do? And these women, they were not trained. They got themselves trained. And it's pretty amazing. And they started this hotline, which I think most people know us for, is just this hotline. And back then we had this line, it hurts to call a domestic violence hotline. It hurts more not to. And people still quote that to me, but it really was. And it was always staffed back then by volunteers. I mean, we still are staffed by volunteers, but overseen by clinical social workers. But it was women taking care of women within the community. Now we serve much larger community. We serve many male survivors, but that was how it was born. And it really was the first national response. There are wonderful programs that are in communities. There's a national response. And I often think about the role of Shalom Task Force as really being the voice for this population. It's a voice to talk about something that nobody really wants to talk about and bring it to the surface so we can have these discussions, both the discussion about domestic violence, which is critically important, and bringing awareness, and at the same time discussions about healthy relationships, which we kind of talk about, but most, we don't really understand always what that means. So it's both. And when you talk about language, that's really what the goal was. So we moved from having a hotline to the volunteers on the hotline saying, oh my goodness, these people are calling and they can't even describe their experience. Like, we need to go into the schools, we need to tell people. And it started by going into schools and just giving people language for what domestic violence is. And now we do things more broad. We talk about healthy relationships, we talk about being a supportive friend, but really giving language to it. And then out of that also came the pressing need for survivors of violence to need attorneys,
Hmm.
because they'd be calling the hotline saying like, I'm ready to leave, but I don't have any legal remedies. And my partner, my husband, my wife, either way, has all the access to an attorney, and I'm going to get stuck, I'm going to get trapped. So we also have free legal services to help navigate both halachic and civil divorce, but also really just to think about safety and what does that mean. And if they choose to pursue going through divorce, we could help them with that, but really to think about what safety can mean and what options are available. So that's kind of like a snapshot of what we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
You know what I find so fascinating is, I think back to the beginnings, and I would say, like, I remember 1994, right?
Yes.
I was, graduating high school in 94, but I think what I also recognize is kind of the trajectory of change that has happened since those earlier days. Even just change from going from domestic violence or to interpersonal violence to, how are we changing that language today? And I know that a big part of that work was also the pushback against leadership, against rabbinic leadership, of like, we can't talk about these things, or we shouldn't be talking about these things, or it's not as bad as you guys really think it is. And I think that that really kind of broke over time. The access to change really happened from the ground up, like where we began to be able to show them the evidence of, like, actually this is really happening. And for somebody who's not really familiar with this world of abusive relationships, it can be really startling. I know that when I've been consulted in cases and somebody shares with me a story, and I'll be like, wait, that really happened by, like, really, like, a religious man and a religious woman. And that's what is happening behind the closed doors that nobody knows about. And it's painful, I think. And I just want to acknowledge that in this moment, as if you are a religious person, and, we hold ourselves hopefully to a value of very different than the one we're going to be talking about. And yet this is happening in our community.
So I also want to say that, like, one of the ways that Shalom Task Force was successful is from within the community, and we did join very early on with Rabbanim with great stature, who really did support us. So, like, Rav Pam, like, who said, now we have an address. I think that's the exact for us to send people. Where I think that it's very well intentioned, and there's always this tension between how do we support marriages through tough times, if there's shalom bias, or just like kind of like things which are within the normal range of the relationship spectrum, where people go through tough times and maybe it's high conflict, but it's not really abuse. So we could talk about with that, how you make the distinction, and then it kind of jumps into this place of abuse, and acknowledging that that's really sometimes really hard to tease out unless you're in that field, and giving support to those who give support, right? So and then also be able to work together and collaborate. And I think, I mean, I was not there. I too was in high school and watched it happen and have seen the trajectory. And I think, and how language has changed in our community, how change happens. But I think the fact that we were early on, and we, meaning the agency, really early on, joined with people who had, the status in the community, to make those conversations happen, has helped. Now we have ups and downs with that. Like, it is very hard, and it's hard to always acknowledge the abuse. I think it's something that continues, and I think in many ways domestic violence. And we use the language domestic abuse in the community because the language of violence connotes, to a lot of people, just physical violence, and as we'll talk about, it's a much larger definition. So,
Yes.
but in the literature, it's going to be intimate partner violence, or
Hmm.
IPV. So, but domestic abuse feels very gray to people,
Thank you.
right?
You just corrected me. I just want to clarify that I use interpersonal from IPT, and it should be intimate partner
Partner,
violence.
yes,
Thank you for
yes,
correcting me.
intimate partner
Yeah.
violence.
It's also
Yeah,
interpersonal, but you are
there we go.
correct.
It
It is
is
intimate
interpersonal, but
partner.
yes, we're talking intimate partner violence.
Thank you.
No problem. So, but I think the struggle that often happens, and this is where everybody needs support, is that relationships are gray, and those of us who have been blessed to be in relationships know that there are times that it's really tough, and like there's a real value to work towards more health in a relationship and better function and pleasure and everything that's good. But that's very, very different than a relationship that is dealing with violence,
So
and abuse.
can you define that for me then, Shauna? I
Yes,
want you
yes,
to split it for me. Split it for me,
yes.
the high conflict relationship versus the abusive
We're
relationship.
jumping really in, right? So
Go in, all in.
abuse relationships are marked by a pattern of behaviors that one person is asserting over the other person to obtain and maintain power and control. Big red, power and control, right? And instills fear in the other person. High conflict could be lack of compatibility. There could be times that are really hard. There could be value issues. There could be, mismatch of sexual drive. There could be a lot of high conflict or very difficult parts in relationships, but it is not marked, and there's a real feeling you get where there's power and control, and the fear is a big part of it, right? So we're not looking at one incident. We're not looking at one time someone yells at each other. That probably happens in most relationships, right? If we're honest. We're talking about an ongoing pattern in which one person is being controlled by the other person. And I want to note that in that definition, we do not say the word physical or sexual violence.
Right, right. Or emotional.
Right. Like we
Yeah.
like leave it open because we lean into this as a definition, right? So finances can be used as a way of obtaining power and control. Now, it might be in a high conflict or even a healthy enough relationship, there's tension around finances, but people have voice, there isn't control over it, you're not afraid to talk about it, right? That's different than being controlled by it. I often think about the difference between a budget and an allowance, right? But again, we're not looking at a snapshot, we're looking at like a pattern here, right? You're looking at technology as something that can be used to control someone else, right?
So
Um,
I want to get granular because
okay, go for
I
it.
don't think that everybody understands what that means to be when we talk about financial abuse or technology abuse. Break it
Right.
down for me.
Okay, break it down.
Start
Okay,
with
so we're going to go
financial
back to the
abuse.
definition. It's a
Yep.
pattern of behavior and that asserts power and control over the other person, right? It's trying to get the power and control. So a financial abuse is how can you use finances, leaning into that definition to control the other person, right? You could limit their access to funds. You could ruin their credit, so they have no options or less options going forward. Right? You can make them lose their job by calling them every day, 15 times and making that not be able to go. You make it impossible for that person to get to their job on time. You could take that person's paycheck and have no access. You could say that, put the person on allowance. That is impossible, right? So we've worked with clients who are of means. We're not talking about a budget when there's a struggle, who don't have enough money for food. And they were visiting, a colleague at a food pantry. Right. They have to get food from a food pantry. And this is all a way of shattering them sense of self, really demeaning them and controlling them. Right. So that's like what a financial abuse may look like. There's probably 3,000 more examples. And then,
Can I add
yeah,
just on a little bit, like
yes,
one level down? What do we
yes,
say also about, one of the things I think I've always struggled with when I hear other people say, like, oh, I have to ask my husband permission, right? If I'm going to
right.
buy something or I want to buy an outfit or a dress. And I think there's a difference between, say, like, do we have
Mhm.
money in our budget versus like, in order for me to buy something, I need to ask permission.
Permission. Right.
That idea of asking permission, for some, I think for some women, they're missing it. Like they're missing that this is an issue of power and control, perhaps because their own parents kind of
Right.
experienced the same
And perhaps
dynamic.
maybe it's cultural. Like there are some
Right.
communities and that's the norm. But if that person, I also think if that person would say, like, I don't want to ask permission, or maybe there's a conversation where, like, we could both spend up to X and after X, like, it's a conversation, right? And
Right.
every family
Right.
has something different around that. Like, I don't
Yes.
know if I'd make a huge purchase, but like, okay, and all of us have different means and resources or just like ability to manage money, right? But what we're looking at is not one thing, right? That's where we look at the pattern. So or there could be a situation where someone's just really not good at managing their finances. And the way they manage it in a family is that one person just doesn't have access, right? And that might be a good intervention for that family, but it's a discussion and it's an
It
agreement
may.
around it. So
Okay.
that's what we're looking at. Right. So we do bring it down to that point. And you're kind of looking at like where else? And we don't look at one dynamic. And never do we ever see one dynamic because
Right.
that's not how it's not how it shows itself, right? It's not going to surface in one space, but you have the financial, and then you have like the physical and sexual, which I guess feel very obvious, but aren't. Like physical abuse, I think we all see those movies or we'll hear about, being, punched and kicked, but also things like pinning someone to a wall so they can't move, being fearful, you're like driving a car in a way that's so irresponsible and scary. Right. So you're afraid for your life. You're afraid that something's going to happen to you. Strangulation is considered a high risk factor. And we see that often in during sexual intercourse, right? So it's kind of confusing for some people that might be part of the sexual intercourse and what they're looking for. It might bring them pleasure, but at the same time, it can be very, very scary. So you're looking at like and strangulation is just very, very dangerous. And people call it choking, but that's what we're talking about. So you're talking about the physical abuse. And then you talk about sexual violence, which is often very misunderstood around how can there be sexual violence within a marriage. And
Yeah.
that's
Go
probably
for
a
it.
podcast for another time, right? No?
I'm willing to
I saw
do
you
it,
said
but
Tali. You had Tali
I did
recently.
have
She's
Tali
great at
Rosenbaum.
that. Yeah, to talk about
Right. Give us the
like
highlights. Give us the
the
highlight
highlights
reel.
of, there needs to be consent within marriage. And
Yeah.
what does that mean, right? And what are the assumptions about what marriage is? And you don't you need to have, and that's it's also a Jewish value, right? It's a Jewish value to have consent within marriage. And what we see within the really in the communities that we serve, and we primarily serve the from communities, the Orthodox communities, is how is that used? The assumption that you have to be available to your spouse. And if you aren't, then you can't blame him for going elsewhere, like the coercion
Right.
involved in that, right? Or
Right.
forcing someone to go to mikveh early,
Mm.
right? Going to mikveh early. And those of us who understand kind of the weight of that and what that would mean to an Orthodox woman, um, and and
Meaning
so that's not
against
only
halacha, right? Like
it's the
against
against
religious
halacha and
law.
against her identity, right? Because it's really kind of the
Hmm.
top three. I would say most of us who are in the community, like we define ourselves by Taharat Mishpacha and being involved in those halachot. And to think about not only that as a sexual violence, also kind of religious violence, right? Spiritual violence, like really demeaning someone's neshama, right? Through that.
Mm.
Or things like, and we tell this to our youth also, saying yes once doesn't mean it's yes always, right? So there's normal experimentation and healthy experimentation with your sexual partner, your husband or wife. And then if it's not comfortable and if it doesn't feel good to you, can you say, I don't want to do this anymore? Do you feel fearful about voicing that? And again, we're looking at patterns of this, right? And we're
Yeah.
not looking for a misunderstanding. We're looking for patterns where someone's so fearful. So I guess we're saying physical and sexual violence, and then we talked a bit about financial violence, and then we think about what other ways can someone, like the toolbox, right? What other ways can someone unfortunately control the other person? And we see technology now as one of the largest ones, right? Where technology, and I always say this, is I love technology in the sense of my children who are tweens. I could find them anywhere because I used to put air tags on their backpacks so I could meet them at home. Now that we live in Israel and they are on buses by themselves, the Aliyah gift was iPhones. I don't know if that was wise, but I wanted to be able to watch them, right? I wanted to be able to watch them leave their school at 2:35, don't ask, and get home. And talk about an adjustment.
Hmm.
And right, so that's a healthy, I would say that's a healthy use of technology, right? I,
Right.
I am supposed to have control over my children and I
Sure.
need to know what they are. Is that a healthy use within families? Well, if it's communicated that we can and we want to be able to keep track that way, maybe it is. But do you have the right to turn it off? Are you being followed? So there are all these ways technology is used in stalking. So we would have clients, right, when I was working at a different organization that would have to change up their day of the week when they come in for therapy because their aggressive, their partner would see them coming to the same address at certain times. And like, how would we manage that? Like, how do you manage that? But there's so many things that happen in technology nowadays that
Right. Right. Right.
it's endless and every day it keeps on going, right? I mean, we talk about kids with cyberbullying, but that also happens, with adults. Or, we had a case that we worked on where there were, explicit pictures taken between husband and wife within the consent, with consent or quote unquote consent within, I'm not sure that she really consented, but within the marriage. And that is not a
Right.
problem, right? Okay, great, beautiful. But then the threat was if you leave me or telling me what's going on, I'm going to let the whole WhatsApp group know see them let them see these pictures. And
Mm.
then think about that. It's sexual violence, actually revenge porn and illegal at this point, but like it's also like using technology to control someone. And he did it. She
Yeah.
left and he did it.
Wow.
And right?
Wow. You introduced a term spiritual violence. Can you just
Yes.
take I think we have to explore that. Like, what do
Okay,
you,
so
can
I'm
you
actually
define?
trying to. I found an article I started writing like 7 years ago about it, and I found it when I was cleaning out some of my files, and I'm like, well, I have to get back to this. But the spiritual violence is again leaning into how to use spirituality and relationship with God, and or use like religious rituals to control someone. So I often think about clients, you have the mikvah, right? How do you use that to control someone or to hurt someone? But I often think about like getting into someone's way in their relationship with God. So let's say in their keeping a mitzvot, or forcing them to keep mitzvot in a way that's uncomfortable to them. Now that's not having a negotiation about how machmir you're going to be in your family. I think
Right. How
most
restrictive or
people
astringent,
right,
just to define
restrictions,
it.
right? Yeah, sorry. I think most people, even if they think they come from the same Jewish background and religious background, are a little bit different than the person they marry. And there's negotiation and there's conversation about we're going to do it this way. I want to do it this way. I'll just go ahead with it. I don't care that much. Okay, I can learn about it.
Sure.
I think that's within norm. We're talking about really forcing someone to keep mitzvot, commandments, in a way that's really uncomfortable to them and adhering to a standard that doesn't sit well with them, right? Without
Right.
discussion. Or the opposite is forcing them to transgress certain rituals.
Mm, mm. I think about
So,
that also, like I think about also how a lot of the ritual practice and religious law is really held within the rabbinic sphere, right? So
yes,
that if the husband is particularly, typically going to be asking the question of the rabbi, I can imagine in a situation where the husband might come home and say, "The rabbi said, and we're not discussing
right,
this any further.
right. And
This is the
how
way
is
it's
it
going to be
asked,
done."
right?
Right.
And who has
Exactly.
access to asking those
Right.
questions? And or very often the husband has more Talmudic halachic knowledge, right?
Hmm.
They studied for longer, so they could come back and say, "This is what it says." And does she know?
Right. Right. And again,
Like,
coming
where
back
does she
down
have
to that
access?
manipulate, right. And coming down to that
Right?
manipulation.
Right. It's
Right.
manipulation, it's control.
Yeah.
And that's not, it's an abuse of something that's not abusive, right? But it's
Okay.
abuse of it, right? We're not saying that
Right.
halacha, Jewish law, isn't itself abusive, but the way it's being
Right.
used is. So, but it's also ways of making someone like transgress things. So we're talking about the mikvah, but like I had a client, who, she was a young Hasidic woman, and two practices were very much part of her life. It was new to me, but part of their lives was the first year of marriage. They eat at their parents' house all the time, right? And they consider that both culturally what they do, but it's also how they're still honoring their family. It's how the community functions. And he didn't allow it. Like, we're not gonna do that. And she was very isolated, which is another form of violence. But also it became like a tension between with her family. Like, she was not as close with them and they didn't like her as much and they were angry at her all the time. And then, she wasn't calling them before Shabbos, right? To say good Shabbos, which is like really standard. And that was really being experienced by her family as very
Hmm.
disrespectful and what's wrong with you, and not knowing that she wasn't being allowed to, right? And so that became a huge, break in the relationship. And when things got worse, she didn't have the resources of her family as much, right? They
Right.
were no
Right.
longer on her side. So there are ways to think about how religious life and spiritual life can be used to control someone. And
Right.
also, the interesting part about like spiritual abuse is that has this, just anecdotally, clinically, is that it has this other. It takes on a life of its own, because once someone's made to transgress something and not adhere to Jewish law in the way that they want to, they feel is important, then they almost feel as if they deserve the abuse.
Hmm.
Because many of us who grow up in the community have this like concept of schar v'onesh, like reward and punishment, and it's kind of part of our ethos, right? Like
Right.
and I'm not saying that's a healthy indoctrination or socialization, whatever we want to call it, but and so oh, I transgressed nida, I had sex during a time I wasn't supposed to have it. Oh, I deserve this abuse. I'm an unholy woman. And
Mm.
it becomes kind of this really terribly sad, very painful and unhealthy circular thinking that so much of
Hmm.
work has to be around, where it's not something you did and you do not deserve this. And let's think through that.
Right.
Let's figure this out together. But it's very, very painful.
I think one of the things that I find the most challenging when talking about abusive experiences of all of the ones you described, I think one of the things that I have the hardest time is that we know the statistics is like women really stay with their abuser. They leave even up to 7 times before they will actually formally leave the abuser. And some of it, I think it really is practical, right? I think we have to acknowledge that for a female to, I remember my mother always saying to me, you need to have a profession because you need to be able to support yourself. I mean, I
Yeah.
was 20 years old, but that was the thing my mother would say, right? And she was very supportive.
Yes.
Like, I mean, and
It's
I
true,
actually
right? There's something about that,
100%
like
true.
resonates, right?
I it's not only is it true, I'm so grateful that I was raised with that idea of if you need to, you can.
Right.
And I think that that's such a value of like it wasn't from an empowered feministic independence. It was from a if you need to, you will be able to. So I think one of the greatest challenges we have is that many women are unable to
Right.
independently support themselves, especially once they hit 3 or 4 kids. Their earning capacity, if they haven't worked full time in a while, is really limited. So
Right.
I think that's like a practical component of the leaving versus the coming back.
I think that's real. I mean, I don't interrupt, but like I think that's real for like non-DV divorce. I think the reality of Orthodox
Yeah,
Jewish
for
life
sure.
is just so expensive that any of us doing it on one income, right? And I would say there are men who would
Totally.
say the same thing, right? Like
Right.
they also need two income
Yeah.
earners to make this
Yeah.
possible.
Right.
And just kind of thinking about how would I do that and what would that feel like, and what that would
So
bring to my family. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, but I want to go back into this. I want to go into the
Yes.
psychological piece of this.
Yes.
Okay. So now you have this person who's recognizing to some degree that there is an abusive component, manipulation, control, power, and they want to get out, right? And
Yeah.
they leave, they come back, they leave, they come back. What is happening psychologically in the lives and minds of women who become victims before they become survivors? And tell me a little bit of the psychological process of how the abused brain, right, responds to these experiences of manipulation, power, and control.
That's huge. Okay, so we call them survivors even when they're still in the relationship, but I agree there is kind of like a journey from victim to survivor. Though there are people who stay within the relationship for years, which would name themselves as survivors because they do make it every single day, and they do find that. I think that the biggest piece clinically when working with these clients is the idea of having power and control in their lives is so much taken away from them that they don't believe they know how to make good decisions. Like they just their whole sense of self has been shattered. And for many of them, it's their only adult relationship. They've been in it for most of their adult life, right? And they may not have made a lot of independent decisions as an adult. And they've been told in many different ways, probably directly, but also indirectly, through the abusive behaviors that they are just not capable of making strong and good decisions. So they doubt themselves over and over and over. On the top of it, yes, it's really, really hard and all that practical stuff that we could talk about forever.
Right.
But it is really hard to make these decisions. And can they survive out there? And is it going to be any better out there without, I know this is the fear of the unknown almost, right? Like I know this monster. I know how to deal with this or deal with this well enough. And right there's all these pieces like, how can I get to a place where I am confident enough to make this decision? So when people say that women leave up to 7 times, I've never actually found that piece of research. I always say I'm going to look up for
Isn't
it.
it amazing how that gets
Yes,
republished
that's
multiple
become
times?
like,
But I
but
know
I can get it, but I don't know what leaving means. Like, do they actually pack their bags and leave? Do they consider leaving? I probably think it's more like they've considered and made some
they've met
gesture
with a
towards it.
lawyer or they've
They
met
met
with
with
a
a
DV
lawyer or they called
counselor.
our hotline, and
Right,
that's kind of very
exactly.
standard. They'll call our
Right.
hotline, and 2 years later, now we don't keep records of who they are. That's very much our policy. I want that to be said. It's completely de-identified and anonymous. We don't know if people have called before. They will tell us. I called 2 years ago, and
Mm.
now I'm ready to think about this again. Or our legal department does keep records, and they're able to see that someone calls, and then 4 years later. And the other agencies I've worked, we've seen that, right? Where we've worked with someone for 3 sessions, and then they weren't engaged anymore, and then we saw them 2.5 years later, and they were fully engaged. So we know that people make gestures towards it, or they start working towards it. Like one client we worked at Shalom Task Force shared that she cut out our flyer from like the Jewish press or something and folded it and put it into her wallet like 6 years before calling us. And she
Wow.
called us because she had just gone back into the workforce after raising her children. She had a professional degree, but her children, I think, were tweens at that time, and she was ready to go back, and she was calling us from her office because it was safe for her to call. And her intention was to work with an attorney and with a financial advisor to get herself into a position that she would know that she can leave in a way that felt safe for her, right?
Right,
And
right.
right and stable.
6 years.
And right,
Hmm.
60, I think it was something like six
Mm.
years, and I
Yeah,
remember sitting there like, whoa, right. But that's what it can take. So maybe her first leaving, quote unquote, was cutting out that piece of paper. And
I
people
hear it.
should do that if they think it's unsafe, but but for her, she felt it was safe. It was folded in her wallet for those 6 years. So what is happening? It's really a process of empowerment, right? Reality checks and empowerment, and really thinking about very like, can you make good decisions? And sometimes that means in the life that you're in right now, where could you learn to have choice?
Mm.
Get to know yourself in a way that you could start trusting yourself and understand that the reason you don't trust yourself is you probably do make some mistakes because all of us do, even the
Yeah.
confident ones amongst us, but it's not because of you. It's because the way and we're using he here because this is a women's podcast,
Yes.
but how the way he's been treating you and what his narrative of you, right? And what
Right.
he's convinced you of. But that's not what's here. And let's find ways for you to
Yeah.
learn, get to know yourself and build yourself that way so you can make that decision.
Can
And it
I
takes
can I
time.
I'm sure it does. And it's really, I have to acknowledge that a number of weeks ago, when we saw one of the hostage release begin, when we began to see hostages being released, one of the things I heard was that they would begin by saying, do you want milk or water? Do you want this cup or this cup? Do you want to walk this way or that way? Like there was all about reinstituting
Choice.
choice because they'd been in an environment where they had none for so many
So have I
days
ever
and
told you
weeks.
my tea story? Have I ever told you
No,
my tea?
no, I don't
Okay,
think
so
so.
when I was seeing clients like regularly, when I was really in like basically full-time practice at a clinic, at an agency, I was seeing domestic violence victims, and I had this crazy collection of every flavor tea you can imagine. And it was partially I was seeing client after client, and I enjoyed it. And also I felt like clients found it very soothing, but partially it was because I wanted to offer them choice. And I remember this one client, I always think of her the first time she came in, I'm like, can I get you a cup of tea? And she's like, I said, what flavor? Whatever you're having. No, tell me. And it was like this like subtle intervention, right?
Therapeutic intervention.
Therapeutic
Wow.
intervention. And
Ooh,
by session 4, I remember it so clearly. She goes to me, I'd like a blueberry tea. Stash makes blueberry tea.
yeah.
Blueberry tea with sugar and milk.
Wow.
And I
Yeah.
looked at her and I said, see, you can make choices. And
Wow.
then it became an interesting conversation. Does she deserve to ask for things that she wants, right? And like, does she have the right to take up that space? But it was this constant mushal, this analogy I would use with my clients,
It's fabulous.
about, right? Like, what does
Yeah.
tea represent, right? And it was a great collection,
That's amazing.
yeah,
That's
but
I
it's
love that.
exactly
Right.
like
That
we're talking about the
idea.
hostages,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like, do you want milk or water? Like you didn't have choice. Let's give you choices. And sometimes those choices may not mean you're going to a shelter or moving out or serving papers right now. Sometimes it may have to be. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
but it may also be like I'm not big into the self-care, take a shower, but but like is there time in your day that you could choose for yourself, that you could choose to do something for yourself? Can you have relationships that give you choice and some sort of enjoyment, and you get to know
Mm.
yourself again? Particularly people who are in long-term relationships like this, they really don't know themselves. They don't
Right.
have
Right.
the
Right.
chance. They haven't had the chance. It's
Right.
been taken from
Right.
them.
I
And the
want to,
analogy of hostages
yeah.
is very, very emotional and kind of really,
Yes.
but
Sure.
it
It's
sits in
truth.
some way. It
Right.
does.
It does.
It does.
I want to be able to kind of narrow it down now into
Yes.
you introduced to me that you said to me the term reproductive violence, right? So when we obviously my podcast is primarily about perinatal and reproductive mental health, but I'll bring anybody interesting that I know onto the podcast because like education is
Happy to be
education,
part of that.
right?
Yeah.
You're like one of my people. But I want and I what I know is that there are significant risk factors for being pregnant when dealing with interpersonal violence and with a domestic violence scenario. Tell me what you know about that. Run the statistics through whatever or what you're familiar with
Right. So
in
I would
terms of
say that
pregnant
we'll often
women.
hear from clients that they'll see an escalation of violence
Yeah.
when someone's pregnant, right?
Yeah.
And we can think about why that is, right? So I think in some way, it is the experience of the abuser losing control, losing all the focus, right? Like why is that happening? Jealousy, it might be fear of the financial strain, it might be anything that feels out of control from them. They're no longer in control and there's someone else there. There's also the feeling that the person feels more stuck in many ways, and it's a true statement. It is much easier to leave a relationship without children. And once children are in the relationship, it's a different decision for people, right? And what is, if a person's now stuck in the relationship, quote unquote, and they are not stuck on that to be, I don't want my
Sure.
sound bite to
Sure.
be
They
stuck,
feel
but
stuck.
if they
Hmm.
feel stuck, right, they feel more trapped because there's now a child involved, then what is that like for them? And they almost have more control. Now, um,
Wait, you're
you know,
saying that the female has more control because
I'm sorry.
no, the opposite.
No,
What are
I'm
you saying?
sorry. The abuser feels, right, that the person, they could act out more and they could escalate violence because now their
They have
partner,
so
they have less
the
control. The
abused
abuser has more
has
control because it's
got
much
it.
harder. It's
Got
much
it.
harder
Thank you for clarifying
to
it.
lose. Sorry.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
apologize for that.
It is only 10 to
So
45 at night. So
yeah, it's finally coming through. But they're losing their, so in the sense of that the person may not feel that before there's a child involved, there's a little bit of like, oh, it's
she
a
could
little
still
less
leave me.
permanent. It might feel a little
Yeah.
less, there's a little bit
Hmm.
more access out, right? Once you have children, it is more challenging to leave, right? For all those practical reasons, right? And the
Hmm.
person's kind
Hmm.
of in your life for the next X amount of years, and you have to negotiate that. So I would say pregnancy can be a risk factor. It is not a solution to an abusive relationship.
No.
Having a
Yeah.
child together will not bring you closer if it's an abusive relationship, right? It will not make things better for a relationship if someone's
Hmm.
gets pregnant. And then we move into and abuse, it becomes physical, is high risk, right? Physically for
Yeah.
women who are pregnant, right?
Yeah.
Like you could think about all the physical, the medical
Right.
issues, miscarriage, God forbid, preterm labor, the stress,
And we have
and
seen that abuse
oh,
actually occurring on the belly, meaning that
yes,
it is not a
and we've
protected
seen it.
space.
No,
Yeah.
it's not a protected space. And pushing someone downstairs when they're pregnant has whole different implications when someone is, than when someone's not pregnant, right? Those and the impact on someone and showing up to an emergency room like that and what happens. Now, this
Hmm.
idea that I brought up, in our correspondence around the idea of reproductive coercion, right? Reproductive abuse, is really again using the realm of reproductive, family planning, to have power and control. And that could look different ways, right? It could be forcing a pregnancy, right? Or with not allowing pregnancy. And this is not discussion about family planning. This is
Right. Right.
manipulating contraception, controlling access to healthcare. So we could talk about it in those ways. And it's interesting that you brought up before, because in some communities in which family planning is discussed with a rabbi, right? Who's presenting that information? How is it presented? How is it, and who has the voice in that discussion? Or should it be both, we'd say both people would have a voice in that discussion. So how does that play out? And there's so many different layers to that, right? Like,
Mm.
do they feel they have to have more children because of the community they're in? And is it being coerced, right?
Right.
And is that an isolated issue in their relationship? And we're not going to call it abuse, but it has to be something that's managed, or is that the pattern of the relationship?
Right.
Right? Because I
Yeah.
think the pressure to have more children and maybe and that experience for both partners is significant.
Right.
And I don't think, but that's still very different. Is this part of the pattern of relationships where there's coercion around that? So that's
Have
some
you
ideas.
Have you had have you heard, because I know I have, and I'm wondering your like much broader experience of women who have actually gone onto an IUD or taken birth control without their spouses knowing? And
I
I'm not
have.
saying that it was recommended, but like I'm not saying that a domestic violence, DV counselor would say this is what you should do. But have you heard, like, what's your experience in that? Because to me, it
I
makes sense
mean,
in many ways.
it does. I mean, I think from one perspective, it feels on the other side like not the right thing to a relationship. Like, isn't it?
Right. Right.
But right. So like there's something about that gives us like,
Sure.
oh, let's pause to think about that. But certainly in situations when there's safety issues, we need to respect if a person doesn't want to become pregnant, right? And yes, we've seen clients that have not told their husbands that they're on birth control and they are on birth control. Um, and we've also talked to clients. I mean, this is more when I was in therapy, doing therapy, not on a hotline. We would not do this on a hotline, but when I was doing treatment, where we would say, it sounds like it's an important thing for you to. I don't know where you make your decisions around birth control and family planning, but it probably makes some sense for you to explore that right now. Like, how do you feel about that? Because it is, as I said before, bringing another child into this is a very big decision, and it will
Yeah.
not solve the domestic violence.
Right. Right.
And if things do get better, which we don't really see very much of, then you could think about then. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say it's something to really consider. And I remember when I was pregnant and I was in the hospital for some kind of observation. Every time I would go in, they would kick my husband out of the room and ask me screening questions around domestic violence, and I would get so happy. Like
Right.
I'm like so happy to talk to them about it, and they're like, "What is wrong with this woman?" And I'm like, "You don't
Right.
understand. I do
Right.
this for a living, and I'm so
Yeah.
appreciative that
Yeah.
he's not in this space right now, and you're asking these very pointed, appropriate questions because
Yeah.
what a great place for intervention, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
um,
Absolutely. By the
but
way, I have a one of the things that is, it's kind of a step to the side, but I know that for many women who are going in for a termination or for an abortion, they are not the spouses or partners are not allowed in the back initially, and that is part of that is the reason, and
yes,
then they are questioning to make sure that there's no manipulation or coercion, that they
yes,
have to have an abortion. It's
yes,
really challenging for someone who's doing that under a TFMR experience, like a termination for medical reasons. And
yes.
so, if I have the opportunity as a therapist, I will warn them that this is the
Mm,
protocol and this is why this is protocol. And as soon as those questions have been answered, you can say to them, I really want my spouse to join me here and now. By the way, in late stage or late term abortions, they're even more restrictive in some of the states. And so, it's just something to be as a therapist, or if those
Yeah.
therapists that are listening, you really want to, before you make a referral for a late stage termination, to know where the partners are allowed or not allowed. And some of them are incredibly restrictive. But for the first scenario, it really
Yeah.
was about making sure that there was no, that they were coming under their
Nothing.
own,
Right. Right. So that
choice.
would be that's
Yeah.
another, example of reproductive coercion or abuse, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Pushing someone to get an abortion they don't want to have
Yeah.
and manipulating the situation that way. So,
Yeah.
but again, it always leans back into that definition of power and control and a pattern of behaviors. So we
Yeah.
don't look at one little piece, we're looking at what's really going on in that person's life and help
Yeah.
them find options, and explore options. And that's not telling them what to do. And that's one thing, people are listening and they have friends. I mean, we all know someone who's in these kind of situations. It's just the reality.
Right.
It's a
Right.
friend, ourselves, anyone. And because the dynamic is really about taking away their power and control, telling them what to do is just mimicking that dynamic.
Say that one more time. Say that one
Okay.
more time. Say that again.
Because the dynamic is about taking away their power and control, telling them what to do is just mimicking that, right? You're really doing power, you're taking over their power and control as well. So it's a really hard place to be in, right? Because you see it so clearly, and you probably do. You might do,
Sure.
right? And
Right.
you're like, just get out of this, or just know that you deserve so much more, or everything that you're thinking, and then telling them what to do. You're gonna be doing what was being done to them, and it's not that in itself. They're gonna most probably align with their spouse, right? Because that's the
Yeah.
person they're with. And then you're no longer a resource to them. So we really want to use language like, I'm here for you. Let me help you connect to resources. I respect whatever decision you make, but I'm always here for you, or I'm concerned about you, right? So I'm always using the I language, but really, but telling them you must leave, or if you have the capacity to actually offer them some practical assistance. If
Right.
you decide to move forward in some way, I know, or I'm able to house you. I wouldn't suggest
Right.
that,
Right.
but like really
Right.
think through what you're able to do. But I'd say Shalom Task Force's hotline, I'd say 30% of our calls are from third parties. They're not
Really.
survivors.
Hmm.
Okay? Because we
Mm-mm-mm.
live in a beautiful community and we serve a community that cares a lot and they
Yeah.
want to be able to help. So it's
Right.
siblings, it's parents, it's friends, it's rabbis, it's rebbitzins, it's college teachers, it's anybody who's
Yeah.
saying like, I'm concerned about someone and
Right.
I need some tools to figure out how to help them in a way that's helpful. And we're there for that
Yeah.
because that's you're so important to them. You're so
Right.
important.
Right. Yeah. It's so powerful because I think about also the risk of if I am encouraging, supporting, or enforcing my perspective and they don't leave, now they've disappointed me.
Yeah.
Right. And so the possibility of them coming and asking for support, help, or, anything again in the future is very low. And so maintaining and protecting the relationship is more important in the long run.
Right.
For the
And we
for the
find people
kid.
become so isolated. And I kind of touched on it before, but one of the biggest signs or red flags of early IPV is isolation, right?
Yeah.
And we see
Yeah.
that even in engagement. Those are the type of things you see prior to marriage a lot in our communities. And isolation is so powerful, right? Because if everybody like is disappointed right, and everybody's like, I told you what to do, I told you not to be with him, and then who do you go to?
Right.
Well,
For sure.
gratefully there are agencies that are available to go to, but we also need communal and
For sure.
family support for the person. So
Yeah.
how to still stay plugged into that?
So we have only a few minutes left. I'm going
Yes.
to ask you to identify some of the misconceptions that you want to make sure people know. And I'm going to ask you, because I just can't miss this opportunity, give me a rundown of the top three things that might be red flags for you in an early relationship. We're not talking about married already, but dating
Right.
relationship. Top three
Sure.
things that should be a red flag for the person and maybe even for the parent. I definitely want to hear from you what your top three would be.
So let's start with misconceptions. Is I
Sure.
think everybody can walk away from this podcast or for anything Shalom Task Force does to recognize that domestic violence is not physical. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be many other forms of violence and abuse. And if we're able to acknowledge that, um, not only are we going to be helpful in validating these people's experience, but also that also is harm reduction, right? We don't go from nothing to physical violence. So we have to acknowledge the whole experience. But the survivors will tell us the most important thing is that people acknowledge this is a big part of it. Top three red flags. Okay, so we started already. Isolation, which could
Yeah.
look like your family and friends are not good enough for you anymore. And, I don't want you to be with them. I don't want you to be with them. I love you so much. The love bombing that's involved in that. And then the person has no more resources.
Right.
Extreme jealousy, like possessiveness and jealousy. We're going for a third. I usually list of five or six. Let's see. Like the story doesn't add up.
Mm,
That's how like it just doesn't make sense. Like the story, like everybody's always wrong and everybody does wrong and it just feels dishonest and it just isn't making sense. And it's yeah, like to like I don't love saying trust your gut because not all of us have developed guts, but remain curious, right?
okay.
And right, remain curious. If something isn't like making sense or if something feels off, like invest in the time to be curious about what that is. And
Mm,
I often think about, and it matters what community you're from, but the worst case scenario is you date X amount of weeks or months more, and you're much happier at engagement. And the other good case scenario is you don't get married to the wrong person. But like, just be curious. Like if something doesn't make sense, then find out why. So I
interesting.
think that's my top three for today. I
Right.
don't know
I
if
love it. And
yours-
I think the first two are a little bit more concrete. The third one is a
right,
little bit more gray, right? But
right.
that, the first two being ones, I think I've heard that in like, if you really love me, then, right? If you
Yeah.
really love me, you'll spend time with me. Really love me, you won't go to the
You
party
won't be
because
friends
then
with
you
them,
won't be
right?
friends
You're
with them.
only
Right.
prioritizing
Right. Right. I don't really like them. They don't really like me. I feel uncomfortable when
right.
I'm around them.
Right. They're
Just
not
creating that
religious
isolation.
enough, or
Right.
that's a big one we see. I mean, another thing I
Yeah.
often think about when, particularly when you talking to young adults, is that you're allowed to have independent lives, and that's often healthier for relationships.
Yeah.
And if he is not letting you have independent life, that might mean just going to college, right, and is interrupting that. Then be curious about that. Is it
Right.
insecurity or is it control?
Yeah.
You
Right.
should have. So
Right.
I often really just. I think the language of curious works because it doesn't mean the person's abusive, but be curious and make sure it fits and let's check it out before you make
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
So
As we close up, I guess I want to lay it out there because we are highlighting the male as the abuser. Do we know what
yes,
percentage of abusers are female?
we do not know what percentage. I'd say we do get a lot of calls from men. I haven't looked in a while, but at some point it was around 17%.
Do we
Once
know
we open,
national statistics?
no, we really
No.
don't. Not in front of me. I mean,
Okay.
I would say that we see male victims of all types of violence, including physical violence, which is shocking to people. I would say since we opened our chat line, we've got a lot more men reaching out because they feel more comfortable. And there are certainly women who engage in abusive behaviors. And, we have to
Do we see
acknowledge
a
that.
difference in the profile in anything that we've been discussing? If the profile is the victim of is a male victim, is there a different profile in terms of power and control or in terms of loss of decision making or anything like that?
No, it kind of
Not
plays out the
really.
same way, really. I
Okay.
mean, it's really the same dynamic.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
will have men say to me, I don't want to hit back. So, I don't want to be that man that hits,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
And what does that look like? But it's certainly
Yeah.
men can be victims. And Shalom Task Force serves male victims.
Yeah.
All of
Yeah.
our departments.
I think it can be confusing for some people as to
Yeah.
like, I think we're so many, in many ways, acculturated to assume that the
Yeah.
male is the male
Yes,
is the perpetrator.
absolutely.
And yet we
Absolutely.
have to acknowledge that they are as well
Now,
a
there are
victim.
certainly more female victims, absolutely.
Yeah.
But we also know that men underreported even more. So,
Right.
we need to have support for everybody. We want people,
Absolutely.
we want everybody to have healthy relationships. So,
Well, this has been a treat, such a treat. As
me
with
too.
most of people I talk to, I'm like, oh, I could talk for another whole hour,
Yes, we
and
can.
maybe we'll have to pick this up
Yeah.
again, maybe an earlier hour of the evening for you. But thank you so much for saying yes.
Thank
So
you.
so
Thank
glad to have
you.
you here.
My pleasure.